My dad.
We are live. We are live. We are 2 minutes early, but it will take us 2 minutes to settle
We're a
down.
rowdy bunch.
We are a rowdy bunch. I don't think popcorn contains sugar,
No, but these two.
but it is carved. So maybe that's what's going on. Okay, we are going today to get our first walks through of the yield bill. And we have Representative Kimball with us. I guess you were presenter of the bill.
Yes.
You were, okay, come on up there. Tell us, this is, I believe, the simplest bill we are going to get Ways and Means.
Okay,
We
all right.
are trying on Tuesday to do a walkthrough. Hopefully, it will come off the floor, but we're going to do an initial walkthrough of 454, I think is the number it's got, and I'm just going to have the drafters. I'm not going to have Joyce this going to say, just the drafters and Representative Kornheiser are going to tell us the words and the thinking behind 454. And eventually next week, some form of it should land here and we will begin in earnest to work through it. So this is the circuit.
That's right. Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Carly Kimball, representative from Woodstock, representing Windsor 5, and from the Ways and Means Committee in the House. So 491 is the yield bill and sets the statewide education property tax rates for fiscal year 2026. So the bill does three main things. It sets the property dollar equivalent yield at $8,596, the income dollar equivalent yield at $12,172, and the non-homestead property tax rate at $1.703 per 100 equalized property education value. So I'm not going to go through that whole bit with you. You'll have legislative
Really well.
driving the fiscal office, but so the bill really proposes to lower property taxes from the initially projected increase of 5.9%, the December 1 letter, to 1.1%, and that's uniform across all property categories, homestead and non-homestead. It uses $77 million from the general fund and to reduce the amounts to be raised by taxes. It also uses the unallocated reserve from previous year's education fund of $41 million. Which over the past 20 years has been a common practice, but not every year. So in the bill, H 491 raises from non-homestead property taxes $908 million. Homestead property taxes, a net after the property tax credit of $153 million, $609 million, and then also maintains the 5% reserve at $55 million. So it's important to say just one last thing, and then I'll get out of your hair. The bill reflects the current state of the K-12 education system, the current costs, not what the projected costs are of the system that we've all been talking about so much about during the session.
It is just based on the budgets voted this year.
That's right. Yeah. So I have 20 pages, but that's
Okay.
stuff.
Just real quick, Charlie, thanks for this. This is great. Is it 77 total or 77 plus the 41 million you're talking about?
77 plus the 44, so it's really $118 million.
Okay. To get you to 1.1.
Which is more than we raised last year. Last year we did 110. If you taxes. Borrow. Sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mark Kimball. But that money, those appropriations are not in this bill. Do they show, are they in?
They are in the appropriations bill. The 77 million is, the 41 million is a natural part of the education
Right.
funds, but the 77 million is in the appropriations.
It's in the
bill.
big bill.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's being made clear at this point, that I've been telling people, Senator Birchwood does, as we watch developments in that city further south.
Manchester.
Yeah, Manchester.
Oh, no.
Yeah, that too.
It, you know, our ability to hold on to all of that 77 million is not guaranteed because we might face the bigger prices before this budget goes into effect, so.
And Madam Chair, we had a lot of discussion about what to do with a request from the governor of the 77 million, whether we wanted to use it at all, because we had at that point like 104 school budgets that had passed without the 77 million accounted for. And we were also looking at the instability at the federal level. In the end, we were responding to a couple of things. One is the real reason why a lot of us came to Montpelier in this session to serve in the legislature was to lower property taxes. And that, and also to really work with the governor in terms of to lower those property taxes as well. We know that we considered, do we hold half this year and then put the other half in, use half? Do we use none of it? Do we use all of it? In the end, our committee voted to use all of it, and the House backed us up on that.
We used to do that with surpluses. Do we buy it down all this year or not? But, yeah, this year, this is an interim bill. It will continue the present system into next fiscal year as we work on a potentially new system and a transition to that new system. Tuesday, we will get your vision of that.
It's a work of art.
I have been told it is. Actually, I was told the drafters were down to almost like a dance troupe. They were so practiced at doing changes.
Wow.
So we're looking
I want to see
forward.
that.
It's artist finger painting.
Wow.
Oh, no, I would
It's
say-
fight work.
We're looking forward to enjoying the presentation on future funding.
Yes.
In the Ed Fund. So, any questions? Not? Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Brett.
Right.
Enjoyed it.
Okay, John, if you want. No, this bill isn't that.
Yeah, I like walking through this one.
I was gonna say, you'll pay though next week.
I'll come back in good spirits.
Yeah.
John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is my favorite bill to walk through. Because all of the information in it was just described by somebody else. Makes my job very easy.
It's 2 pages.
So section 1 sets out the figures that you just heard. I won't repeat them, but I did want to address one question, which I think the committee understands. But Senator Harding was raising the point that we don't see the 77 million appropriation here. What I want to call out about the figures here is that they do reflect that that's what's done. So if you happened to look at the House Ways and Means Committee page at the different drafts of this yield bill, you would see a version that contained a reserve and would have quite.
So this sets the yield, but it figures in an extra $77 million in revenue than we actually have in the Ed Fund right now. It's, if we did it with the 42 million surplus or excess revenues that's in the Ed Fund, those numbers would be different.
Exactly, you would need to change the number. These
Yeah.
numbers assume that what you need to raise
Right.
has been reduced by that amount.
Right. So as we communicate with the people across the hall, which is probably why we're gonna need to hold on to this for a while. To find out if we can hold on to it. Okay, so.
And then quickly, just section 2 is a technical update. This is nothing to be, to demand too much attention, but last year, you'll recall that there's a proposal to include this concept of statewide adjustment to account for fluctuations resulting from the CLA. At the time that that was implemented, there's a place that it was missed. This particular section is talking about the property tax credit. And so when we talk about the equalized value of the house site, if you didn't make the same update for the statewide adjustment in this application for CLA, the result would be that it would actually expand the PTC basically. And because that was not a deliberate choice, This is just a technical fix to reference statewide adjustment where you need to reference
Okay,
it.
so we referenced statewide adjustment in several
Exactly.
other sections. We missed.
Yep.
The, what is it, number resulting of municipalities common level appraisal. Statewide adjustment. Okay, so what did we miss in here? Equalized value of the home site and the taxable.
Exactly. So when you were determining that figure for purposes of the property tax credit, you referenced the CLA, but didn't have the statewide adjustment.
Okay, so this just.
Fixes that. Yeah.
Because we made an adjustment last year to how the CLA was applied. So that we shrank the difference between
Exactly.
the tax rate people thought they were going to get and
Mhm.
the generally inflated tax rate they got when the CLA was, and in some cases that could be large. Okay. So we got one technical correction, which is bigger than adding an S.
Yes.
I just had to do. And, okay, any questions? And the yield is $8,596 per student. Right?
Yeah, so this is, when you're figuring out the rates, you're taking your per pupil spending and dividing by the yield. So this is that denominator of that calculation.
Okay. Questions? Yeah, that's it.
Wonderful.
You have something for us?
I haven't had fun outlook.
Okay, that's yours good.
Okay.
I'm gonna leave some room for other testimony unless you guys need.
Sure.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
I think as of next week, you'll probably be camping in here.
Yes. If you want souvenirs, reach out.
I'll send you an email, Joanne.
Okay, I'll see you then.
Is he taking a PJ?
I think he is.
Ooh. Okay, so.
Oh,
I'm Julie Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. In the Zoom, there's two documents under my name on the committee page. One is fiscal note representing the Ed Fund Outlook in words, and then there's the Ed Fund Outlook. I'm gonna go ahead and share the Ed Fund out. Wait, that's wrong. Here we go. So this is the corresponding Ed Fund Outlook with the yield bill as passed by the House. There's a few columns on here. We've got FY25. It says projected, including BAA. What that's really reflecting is some of those appropriations that will need to be adjusted either in the budget or somewhere else.
That's not supposed to be. I'm sorry.
And then for FY26, the two columns that I've included here are the December 1 letter, and then H491 is passed by the House. So this is where you see that 1.1% average bill increase across all three classes that Rep. Kimball and John mentioned. The corresponding yields, uniform non-homestead property tax rate, the 77 million in one-time general fund transfer that was assumed in the House construct, you can see on line 8. And finally, that 41 million of unreserved, prior year unreserved surplus can be seen here on line 40 for FY26. You see that you're using it all up by having essentially nothing left on the bottom line. FY26, and you see that unreserved and allocated in FY25 on line 40.
But our reserve is.
This construct assumes the stabilization reserve is fully funded to 5%.
Okay,
You see that here in lines 33 through 36.
yeah. So what would the yield be without 77? You know that?
I do. That's actually the document that I accidentally shared at first because I have a feeling you might ask that. And a lot of this modeling was presented, or some iterations of this was presented during the group. Sorry, I'm a little tired during the group testimonies. So if there were to be, I can either go ahead and share one of the outlooks that Ways and Means was looking at, but if none of the 77 million were to be used, but the full 41 million were to be used, the average bill change would be 5.8% average estimated increase. So it'd be a yield of 8,224, property income of 11,584, and a non-homestead uniform rate of $1.782.
So we brought it down to report over 4%.
Correct.
Can I have a question? So that's about what the December 1 letter had. Did the December 1, did they use the full 41? They're supposed to use all that reserve, right?
Yes, that's correct. So the December 1 letter that there's written into statute is the construct that we have to do so that we can reach consensus. Part of that construct is using the full unreserved, unallocated, the full surplus to uniformly buy down rates. December 1 projected 5.9% average increase. With the updated data, school budgets have come in a little bit lower than originally forecasted. So now we're at 5.8. If there were to be no general fund transfer and everything else were to remain constant. The other piece that I do want to flag here that's different than the GovRec proposal is this is fully funding universal school meals.
Okay,
Of course, the December 1 letter also assumed the fully funding of universal school meals because that's a statutory category program.
okay. So, any questions, Senator Chip?
This is an impossible question to answer, but we're gonna ask it anyway. With all the chaos we're hearing out of DC, and I heard about 1.7 million less for some school funds and then $7 million of ESSER funds being retracted. Does any of this reflect our current understanding of shortage of dollars coming from the federal government in the current state of affairs that we know about today?
No, there's no adjustments that have been made to these figures to reflect federal funding changes. It's important to note that everything that we're looking at here is state dollars. So to the extent that federal funding were to be reduced, then there would be the policy question of how do state dollars make up for that reduction? And if so, how much? So does the state fill any hole that we don't know if there's a hole there? And then that may fit into here, but none of that is contemplated in this.
Just a quick question, if funds are already obligated from ESSER, and ARPA, but mainly ESSER, then it seems like the state that would become part of said spending. The districts would have to now take on the burden that was supposed to be held by the federal government, and that would come out of the ED fund, so it would have to be paid for by the state.
I don't know. That would be illegal. I would need a phone a legal friend in terms of how the contractual obligations may or may not change based on fund availability. Which is funny.
We should check on funds. There's triple-E and special ed. A good portion of what's left of the education department federally funded.
And Title 1. It's like Title 1, 2, 3, and 4. Or the Title 1 and 4, I think, are the biggest ones. One is the biggest, but 4 is ELL. I think.
To be clear, there is a significant amount of money that is coming to Vermont education in terms of federal funding. We know that Ed Fund Outlook is only reflecting the state dollars, so it's not capturing all funding going for the purpose of educating children. The AOE, I don't believe that they ever published it this year, but in previous years, their budget book has a great outline of the federal funds available and, thank you. This is something that Ways and Means was contemplating as well, in a very similar conversation, so, Rep. Kimball had this ready to go.
I'm just thinking, I saw something published on the internet, so it must be true. We were actually, was it somewhere around 8 to 10%?
I don't know the percentage off the top of my head, but in terms of federal funds, we're talking about tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in federal funding. So I could certainly follow up and send that link, send this paper that Rep. Kimball passed me, as a link to share with the
Okay,
committee.
if you just send that, that'll be fine. We can have Ed come over and talk to us about
Yeah.
what they're planning.
But I just think there's a difference between cuts that we know are coming and that we can adjust to rather
Right.
than funds that have already been obligated that are now being rescinded from.
And we will ask them to come over and talk to us about. that. There are already lawsuits on other contractual things that I'm sure that there could be more. Lawsuits do cost money. So there will be some decisions made if that's what it comes to. But we should have an idea as to what's at risk, because I don't know that our schools understand that a lot of this foundational money is at risk. And if there is a downturn in the economy and the sales tax goes south, their funding from us is at risk. And there is no way we can make up all of that funding. And so we need, I think, be encouraging some contingency funds as to, in an event of a catastrophe, what services do we preserve? What can the state afford to do? What's essential in our education? I think the superintendents talked about that yesterday, so it probably would be a good exercise to start asking the departments to go through. Okay, any questions for Julia? Thank you.
What should we do, Julia?
Maybe we are once again way ahead.
I can't say that.
She would maintain her.
Non-partisan.
We didn't get that disclosure up front.
No, I'm gonna try and go, I've got Vita on. I did ask the chair Vita yesterday at the chair's meeting, and she said unless they were doing something really foundational to Vita, they had a full plate down there and she didn't want to deal with it.
Okay.
So we will vote that out. I've got that off this afternoon. We have Rick coming tomorrow. I believe, to go over the amendment to the UCC. That was the one about brokerage accounts. But when I talked to him, he said something to consider. It's like only 2 states had passed that, so we might want to give it a little time to percolate in the real world before we did that, but we'll talk to him tomorrow about that.
We do have Dan Swanson in the waiting room already. He wasn't
Yeah.
scheduled till 2:45. Do we want to go ahead and do?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, if he's in there that early, yes, okay. All right. And Dan is from Swanson LLC. Okay. Okay, Mr. Swanson, thank you for being with Senate Finance today. And just introduce yourself for the record and tell us who you represent, and then the floor is yours. And at this point, you have as much time, I think, as you would like.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, my name's Dan Swanson. I am an attorney based in DC, and I have worked on card payments policy for nearly 20 years at the federal level. Most of that working for U.S. Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who was the lead sponsor of federal debit card reform legislation in 2010, and the lead author of credit card reform legislation that was first introduced in 2022. And we also worked very closely with Senator Welch. He was our lead champion when he was in the House of Representatives on debit reform, and is a lead sponsor in the Senate now.
He did talk to this committee at that time.
I beg your pardon, madam?
I said Senator Welch did talk to this committee. He was actually the vice chair of this committee. So.
And one of the finest men I've met in government. He was always a pleasure to work with. So I have worked at the federal level up until from 2006 up until 2023. Then I left Capitol Hill, became a solo consultant where I've advised a number of states that are looking at different state reform efforts. And I should add, I was born in Burlington. We moved away when I was a little kid, but my grandparents lived in Stowe. I've got family in Burlington and South Hero, so I'm able to get up to Vermont quite a bit, and I'm always happy to be there. So it's a pleasure to be here today. I understand that the committee has heard testimony last week from a number of folks about S-135. I'm here to answer any questions that you may have, but thought I would follow up on a few points that came up during last week's discussion, if now's the time for it.
Yes, please.
Great. The first point I want to make is that I think from my experience and having followed this issue for a number of years, the status quo is just unsustainable right now when it comes to swipe fees. These fees are excessively high and keep growing. And because of the way they're structured, with Visa and MasterCard fixing fee rates on behalf of all of the card issuing financial institutions in their network, these fees are insulated from normal marketplace competition that would ever lead the fees to go down. So last month, a industry analyst called the Nielsen Report came out with the latest stats on these fees, and they said that for Visa and MasterCard credit card fees, swipe fees went up from an average of 2.26% in 2023 to 2.35% in 2024. So the fees keep going up. There are multiple fees, that are deducted from the transaction each time the money passes between the banks. The interchange fee is the biggest piece of this, but it is unique amongst fees because banks receive the money, but they do not compete with each other over the fee rates. They let Visa and MasterCard set the fee rates on behalf of all of them. And at the end of the day, because a dollar that is transacted by card doesn't mean a dollar ends up in the merchant's bank account, 97 cents or so ends up, it causes consumer prices to go up. They have to raise prices to cover the cost of these deducted fees. And so these fees end up being inflationary for consumers. I don't know the latest as of this moment as to what the tariff situation is looking like, but if we do end up with heavy tariffs imposed, that's going to make swipe fees even worse because they are largely set as a percentage-based fee rate. So when prices go up due to inflation, the fees go up. That then causes prices to go up further to cover the increased fee amount. You're going to have merchants pleading for more relief if we're in a high tariff situation. Another important point, sort of from the historical perspective on this, is we have tried a bunch of different ways to correct what we saw as the market distortions caused by centralized fee fixing from Visa and MasterCard. Both at the federal level and state level, there have been a number of efforts to try and, in our view, bring some type of competition, transparency, some reform that would help lead to an environment where the fees are not so high in excess of what's actually needed to process the transaction. And we found that basically the credit card industry opposes any effort to change the status quo. But other countries around the world have not waited. And we've seen some pretty dramatic interventions in other countries where they have capped the fees or had the government negotiate with Visa and MasterCard over fees, like in Canada. And on the debit side, federally here in the US, we have had fee caps as well as guaranteed network competition by requiring there be 2 networks on every debit card. So this is S-135 is a pretty modest reform compared to what's been done around the world with fee caps or government negotiation. But it does get at one of the most egregious problems with the current system, which is having the fees imposed on revenues that the merchant does not keep, the tax and tip portion of the transaction. Basically, the merchant is being penalized for collecting that on behalf of the state and of employees. And I know there was some discussion last week about, how do you do this logistically? Is this too complicated to do? Do the logistics of it work? What we have found is, and we found this with federal debit reform back in 2010, is that the industry will typically claim that any change is too complicated to do. But when the law changes, they do it. It's not too hard for them to do. And for this particular change, to segment out taxes and tips and subtract them from the fee amount against which the interchange fee rate is multiplied is not particularly difficult. All merchants, I can't think of any that don't have point of sale software that segments out the tax and tip portion and shows that on the customer's receipt. That information is part of the regular data flow in transactions. It is, conveyed to the network and to the other participants in the ecosystem. And so it would just be a question of doing the subtraction of those amounts identified as tax and tip if the information is transmitted at the time of the transaction before you multiply the percentage rate that Visa and MasterCard set for the fee. This is level 2 data for the tax information. If you may have heard about, it is part of the data flow. It's available to all merchants. And then the tip portion is it's transmitted as part of the settlement process that you get to the banks after you write the tip onto the check that you receive. So Visa and MasterCard have this data now. They actually try and sell it back to merchants. So it shows that they can handle it and they are capable of administering it. It's just typically that they have incentive to say that it's difficult for them to use it if merchants would end up getting a break because of the way that data would be handled to exclude a portion of the transaction from the tax and tip. And then finally, just wanted to discuss the Illinois litigation, which I know there's been a lot of discussion about and questions about what does that mean with respect to state efforts to try and regulate in this area. And I think there's been a lot of confusion in the sort of public debate about what the court has done to this point. Illinois passed a law which was similar to S135 in many respects. It applied to all the participants in the payment system, to the processor, to the card issuing bank, to the merchants bank, and to the card networks, and said that none of them can collect or charge interchange fees on the tax and tip portion. And financial trade associations brought a lawsuit in federal district court in Illinois and said, we think that federal banking laws and credit union laws apply to preempt states from regulating the business of banking or credit unions' role in the system. And at the preliminary injunction stage, the court heard arguments on that and said they think that it's sort of a mixed bag as to which participants in the banking and credit union system might be able to be regulated by the states. But the most important part, in my view, of the decision that came out, preliminary stage again in December from the court, was with respect to Visa and MasterCard, because the banks had argued that Visa and MasterCard are preempted as well under national banking laws from being regulated by the states. And the court did not find that persuasive. They specifically considered that and rejected it. Visa and MasterCard are not banks, but Visa and MasterCard do set the fees for all the banks in the system, and they dictate the rules for how all the transactions operate in the system. So states have authority, as the law or as the court interpretation now stands in Illinois, states have authority to rein in what Visa and MasterCard do within the system. And if you change Visa and MasterCard's behavior, in particular with the setting of fee schedules that they now do that all banks use, then you change the system. So if Visa and MasterCard are told you cannot continue to set fee rates that apply this percentage-based transaction to the amount that includes the tax and tip to it, Visa and MasterCard will have to change their fee schedules. And as of today, every bank in their network copies and uses their fee schedules, which is the core and a competitive problem, in my view, with the whole system. But S135 tries to get at a symptom of the problem as opposed to changing the entire structure of it. So happy to answer any questions you may have about any of this or any other points that have come up in your consideration of the bill. But again, really appreciate the chance to talk with you today.
Dan, can I ask you a question?
Certainly.
I remember hearing about this a few years ago where there was some hubbub where merchants that were not permitted to charge a credit card processing fee or they couldn't give a cash discount. But I feel like that worked its way through the courts. I'm wondering if you could tell me, can any merchant right now that currently takes credit cards assess a credit card processing fee as an option for when they take the credit card, effectively offering a cash discount, or is that not allowed on some transactions?
So by processing fee, you mean a surcharge that would be imposed at
Correct.
point of sale on the cardholder? Yeah. So in all states but two, I believe now, state law permits it. And for many years, Visa and MasterCard's network rules were very limiting in what they would allow to happen for surcharges. There was a litigation settlement in 2013, which was actually later thrown out of court for being too unfavorable to consumers and merchants. But as part of that settlement, Visa and MasterCard changed their no surcharge rules and now allow surcharges, but subject to some pretty strict conditions. Their rules are very long. There's hundreds of pages of rules, but they have some pretty strict details about how surcharges are portrayed, how much can be surcharged, and basically what merchants can say about it when they surcharge. So they can do it. And increasingly in recent months and years, you've seen more merchants doing it. Merchants in general, I've found, don't like to do it. It makes them look like the bad guy. Consumers typically think that the merchants are trying to hose them. But it is, I think, an act of desperation by merchants because they can't eat the 3% that they're having deducted from their transactions. So it has to get passed along. I will say there is an argument economically that having a surcharge applied just to credit card holders is better than merchants having to raise the price for everybody. But I think you don't need this high a fee in the system for the transactions to happen. And we see that credit card transactions work just fine in Europe, where they're capped at 0.3% of the transaction amount. The only reason why they are this high is because this is a structurally anti-competitive fee, where you have essentially giant card network duopoly, Visa and MasterCard, with 85% of the market setting fee rates on behalf of thousands of banks. So the banks don't have to compete with each other over them. That's the core problem, which, I think S135 tries to get at a symptom of.
Just to clarify, though, this bill does not set a cap. This bill just doesn't apply the fee to taxes or tips, right?
Correct. This S135 gets at one of the most egregious effects of the way the current system is structured. I think in a more competitive market, you would see networks, compete to try and win merchant business by saying we won't charge you for the taxes and tips. But Visa and MasterCard are duopoly. They have 85% of the market. It's very hard for merchants not to take Visa and MasterCard. Right now the banks do not compete with each other over fees. So they're not, negotiating with merchants over giving them a break on taxes and tips. That's a core problem with the system, but S135 gets at, in my view, sort of one of the problematic symptoms of what we have.
Okay, but Visa, MasterCard, well, their representatives have said to us in the banks that they can't separate out those tips and, and so they're saying they can't. You're saying they can. Vermont is a very small part of anybody's market. I have a feeling in Europe, it's a whole country that's negotiating. Because I can't see how this isn't part of interstate commerce. And we've run into this before when Senator Welch was here, that there's limited that especially a very small state can do, because we aren't a threat if we pull out of their market.
Sure. I would say a couple of points in response to that. First, the way the bill is structured, there are two options for how merchants can seek relief from interchange charged on tax and tips. They can try and do it during the transaction by transmitting the tax and tip data, or they can do it afterwards as a post-transaction reimbursement, or essentially getting a credit for the money that was charged to them. So it is actually up to the merchant's discretion, first of all, whether or not they want to pursue the relief. They have to send the information either during the transaction or after for the card networks to be on the hook to say that we're not going to charge the fees to them. So that's one point. The way that it would work at the time of transaction, the tax information is in what's called level 2 data. It is part of the data flow that goes from the merchant to card network and the other participants in the system right now. That is data that some merchants may have to change and update their software in order to have that visibly go to the network in every situation, as opposed to now for some of their cards. But it's accessible to all of them, and we have processors on the record saying that this is available to all merchants. You just might have to upgrade your software to do it, but you wouldn't have to swipe the card twice. You wouldn't have to get a new point of sale hardware system in order to do it. It's all just data that would go back and forth. But for any merchant that felt that this was the software update was problematic for them to get, or making that change at the time of the transaction, would be able to come afterwards and say, okay, we have data on the taxes and tips that we accrued during this period. Submit that data to the card network and seek a credit against future payments for that. So it is not. There are multiple options for how to make this work from a logistical standpoint for everyone. And again, at the end of the day, if Visa and MasterCard change their fee rate schedules, which are what everybody follows, to say that when they do the calculation, the math subtracts the tax and tips before you multiply the percentage by it, then the rest of the system will fall into place for that. It's really the networks that play the key role.
Okay, if we have a lot of small merchants, I'm assuming it will cost, we got folks doing swipes on their phones and doing Venmo, and I collect sales tax for the state. The only way I can prove that sales tax, because the store doesn't have a computer system or keep a record, is I have bags of sales slips. And so I have to prove that I have actually collected X amount of sales tax. And I assume for a merchant to prove that they had paid X amount of rooms and meals tax and X amount of tips, they would actually have to keep copies and send in all of those slips, because I can't see a credit card company saying, oh yeah, you just tell us that you've collected $20,000 worth of tips. And we're just going to discount that. So I think it's easy to say, but how would that work? And
Sure.
What would it cost to upgrade your data system?
Sure. So again, it would be to the discretion of the merchant how vigorously they want to pursue the relief under this bill. If a merchant currently has a point of sale software system and a relationship with their processor, where this data is collected and transmitted real time, it's not going to involve much, potentially just a software upgrade like your iPhone updating in order to have this work for you. If you are a merchant, I'm sorry.
Said Walmart will be fine.
Sure. If you are a merchant who does not have a current point of sale software system, and you don't want to invest at the front end in getting one, you do everything in the old way, which again, you don't find many merchants that way these days. And again, most merchants already currently have a system which will itemize the sales tax and any tip on the receipt right now for the customer anyway. So they're collecting that during the transaction. But for any merchant who doesn't want to pursue that sort of during the time of transaction approach, they can collect that information and transmit it afterwards. Now, there may be some questions and folks saying, well, we want to make sure that it's audited and that we don't have people trying to misrepresent what they collected in taxes and tips. I think it would have to be data which is more than just somebody scribbling numbers on, a piece of paper. They'd have to be able to have an audit trail, but that's the same with their sales tax collection right now. They'd have to be able to verify, what they did. So it is not a mandate on merchants that they have to get point of sale software that can allow them to identify this information every transaction. real time, it gives merchants some options to do it. And again, this is not rocket science for the very sophisticated card networks, and banks that are participants in the system. They have said, I've seen Visa testify, in other states where they've said we can do it. They aren't going to do it on their own. This is not in their interests to give merchants a break on this when they've got the duopoly and there's not really other competitive options for merchants to use.
Okay, could they up their rates to offset any inconvenience?
So the bill has a provision on that. It says that you could not have manipulation of rates to circumvent the effect of the tax tip prohibition. And you need that because in this Georgia testimony that Visa testified at, they said, they would try to do that. They would try and manipulate the rate that applies to the other part of the transaction, the non-tax tip part, to get to the same place. So you would have to have an anti-circumvention provision to prevent them from doing that, from getting to the same number by applying a higher rate on the rest of the transaction.
Okay, send her back, Ethan.
Yeah, hey Dan, so I own a store. I have a point of sale that sells into all 50 states in the US. They're POS systems. And I spoke to them and they said they don't have anything like this that would allow this to even happen. So I guess I'm in your bucket there of having to, if my point of sale operator decides to upgrade the software, and I can tell you there's going to be an annual fee and a quarterly fee for that, if they can even do it. If they can't do it, I'm into the reimbursement world, and I can't even begin to tell you how hard it would be to claw back money from a corporation, much less a credit processing corporation. I would have no confidence that that would ever even really happen. But the bigger question here is that, if you want to solve the whole problem of competition, why aren't people considering having the card holder be responsible for the convenience fee that goes along with that card?
They have the ability to do that.
Which they can do.
So to your second question, you mean surcharge to have on every credit card transaction?
I'm talking about it. If you have a card and there's a convenience for you to have that card and you use that card, that credit card processing fee is the responsibility of the card holder and not the merchant.
That's a surcharge.
It's not a surcharge. It's a surcharge from the credit card company,
It would be on.
not from the
credit
business.
card bill, not on the merchant's.
Yeah. Solves the
I
common.
mean, I would argue that consumers do bear the cost of these transaction fees right now. It is baked into retail prices. Merchants have had to pass that cost along. So a surcharge, a surcharge arguably just makes it clearer to consumers what is currently hidden and baked in, in most situations to just the price that all consumers pay. But again, it comes back to, from the core sort of antitrust problem, the fees don't need to be this high. In a competitive system, they wouldn't be. It's just because you have third-party companies, Visa and MasterCard, fixing rates on behalf of thousands of banks who don't compete with each other over their rates, that they get this high. It's something that is just inherent to the structure of the way that these credit card networks have developed, where other countries have looked at that and said, well, we can't just let Visa and MasterCard dictate what the rates should be, because they have incentive that, they charge their own fees. The more transactions that happen, the more they profit. They have incentive to make these fees that banks get as high as possible, because banks will issue more cards and give more incentives for consumers to use them. And then merchants are over a barrel. Everybody's got cards in their pocket. You can't really stay in business without accepting them. So in other countries, they've gone the capping route, where they've said, okay, we're going to cap fee rates at a certain amount. And that's what we did federally on the debit side. We said, if Visa and MasterCard are going to fix fee rates on behalf of banks with over 10 billion in assets for debit, the fee rates must be reasonable and proportional to the cost of processing the transaction. That's been the law since 2010, on the debit side of the US. But there are some folks who say, we don't want to go to capping for credit rates in the US yet. We want to try and find, more middle ground solutions before we might have to go there as a last resort. I think that's what this is. This is identifying a portion of the transaction that the merchant doesn't retain but gets penalized for, gets charged a fee for right now. And at least saying for that part of it, we're not going to penalize the merchant for collecting sales tax on behalf of the state or collecting tips on behalf of the employee. And getting back to your first question, Senator, about the option for merchants, whether or not to do this, the bill drafts it as an option. A merchant, even a very sophisticated merchant that has all the software set up today, might decide they don't want to pursue this relief for very small dollar transaction amounts because the cost of pursuing it exceeds the savings that they get for sales tax on a $1 transaction. But this would give them the choice if they decide that it is worth it for them to pursue this relief. They could do it either real time or afterwards. And I think you would find processors who merchants sign their agreements with would compete with each other to try and offer this service for merchants to make it easier for them to do it. Whereas Visa and MasterCard is not a competitive market situation. There are a lot of processors and they compete for merchant business. So I think you'd see them pretty quickly, try and make this as user-friendly as possible for merchants to do so they could get more merchant contracts for themselves.
It'd be far simpler, transparent, and competitive. It just said the cardholder responsible for the fee.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue they are paying the fees today. It's baked into the prices of everything we pay for. We've got reports saying right now they estimate about $1,200 per family per year in higher prices people pay because of these transaction fees.
Okay, Senator Hardy.
Yeah, I mean, I would just argue that we are paying the fee and we're paying it to a multinational corporation
In a very non-transparent.
in a non-transparent way for sure. But instead of just finding a different way to charge the fee, we should be following what Europe has done and just say there are limits on what you can pay for the fee, if charges fee, because they are just bilking customers, bilking all of us for every time we use our card. And our small merchants like you are paying for it because you have to raise your prices to pay for those fees. So we got pushback on this, Dan, from our Bankers Association because they said that the fee itself is hard to pick apart for how they pay banks versus pay the credit card companies. Is that as complicated as it sounds, or is that simpler than that?
So there are several fees that are deducted from the transaction amount as it passes between the banks. There is a fee that the merchant's bank charges the merchant and deducts. There's a fee that the processor will deduct. There's a fee that Visa or MasterCard deduct called a network fee. The biggest fee component of what gets deducted is the interchange fee. And that's what this tries to get at. And that is the fee that Visa and MasterCard fix on behalf of the banks who get it. So that, not all the regulatory approaches try and get at the whole universe of fees, but we're comfortable with that because there are competitive markets for merchants' banks. There's a lot of banks that merchants can use.
The interchange fees, which this bill is trying to get at, are set by Visa and MasterCard, but the fees are actually paid to the banks.
That's right.
Oh, that makes sense. A lot of banks are against it. Okay.
Yeah.
So right now, the banks do not, and this is really unique amongst fees that banks charge. They do not have to compete with one another. JP Morgan Chase and local community bank both get the same fee schedule and use it that Visa establishes for all banks in their network. So they just don't have to compete. It's all done for them, but it is inherently competitive when you do it that way. Now, Visa and the banks would argue, oh, it's too complicated to do it any other way, to build a network, unless you have and get both sides, merchants and banks, to join, unless you have centralized fee fixing. And maybe that argument held weight 50 years ago when they were trying to establish and create these networks, but they are dominant now. I mean, this is 85% of the card network market. Credit and debit cards are a majority of transactions that consumers pay for. They are established, and we're at the point now where we have ceded control over how money is used in the country, largely to rules and fees that Visa and MasterCard dictate. And most countries have looked at that and said that's not sustainable. It's just too easy for them to pull a bigger and bigger toll out of the money as it passes between the banks. And they've reined that in, whether it's through caps or government negotiation over the rates or other antitrust or central bank, regulation. So there's a broader problem here for sure. And this bill, gets at a symptom. It gets at one of the effects of the current structure. But it's an important effect that has a real difference. I mean, I've seen a stat that in Vermont, there's 14 million in 2023 that was paid by merchants in interchange fees on collected sales tax. And while that's nothing for Visa and MasterCard with their 50% profit margins, for a small business, it's a meaningful difference if they can save, especially for restaurants, what they can save on paying swipe fees, on tips. So it would not solve the problem for sure to pass S-135, but it would create another option for merchants to pursue some relief when they're looking for any help that they can get at this point with dealing with these fees.
Okay, but you kept using the word country. Other countries. This is a small state. The one state that has enacted something similar to this is in court. So until that, the ability of the state to do this is determined. If we're going to take this forward, I'm going to have the Attorney General come in and talk about, is this a fight they want to have at this time? Considering all the other possible contractual litigation we might end up with in the federal government, for funds not delivered. I think, if we could just do this, it would be fine. I think the question is, what's the risk to the state in doing this?
Sure. And to that point, Madam Chair, the Illinois litigation is at a preliminary stage, and the credit card industry is saying, based on what the judge has indicated, at this preliminary stage, they think that national banks, for example, are guaranteed to be preempted. States cannot, enact laws that are going to regulate the business of national banking. That hasn't actually been decided by the court yet. It was at a preliminary injunction stage where the judge said, we think it might turn out that way. But if they're going to claim, and they are, that's basically how it's going to be, then the judge has also said she's considered the argument that Visa and MasterCard cannot be regulated by the state and rejected that and said she didn't buy it. So the same posture that this argument about national banks being preempted is in, the court is also in the posture of saying that Visa and MasterCard can be regulated. So the litigation will continue in Illinois. I believe the next stage is going to be discussed next month. But for where it is right now, and there's more than half the states have bills that are getting at some type of form of relief, whether it's closely modeled after Illinois or taking on other provisions as well. States have had to just work with the law as it stands right now, which is what the bill in Vermont does too. I would argue there is a strong legal argument that states can rein in Visa and MasterCard's behavior. They are not banks. They are not regulated like banks at the federal level. And they are engaging in activity right now, which is dramatically impacting all the merchants and consumers in each state. And they are certainly capable of changing their behavior to accommodate any state. I mean, these are global companies. They have different fee schedules for different nations and regions across the globe. They accommodate, different laws, ranging from places where the fees are capped to places where the government negotiates to places where there's all kinds of restrictions on what they can do. They can change their behavior to accommodate what Illinois has done and what Vermont has done. They have every incentive to claim that it would be, difficult and painful for everyone to do it. But, they said the same thing when we passed debit reform in 2010. And once it took effect, they did it just fine.
But debit reform was national. I think we have said you can set a limit to, the amount of the bill you can put on a master charge. You can't go in and charge a pack of gum anymore in most places. But this one, is much more interstate. And I guess the question for us is this what we want to do? Or would it be better if we just said in the state, you can't charge more than X% interchange fee? I mean, yeah, and I'm gonna have to look to the Attorney General for counsel on that one. And see where it goes.
Sure, I would always, seek counsel from attorneys on questions like that. I do think, there are state bills out there right now which would take, a broader approach than excluding interchange from tax and tips. There are bills which get at some of the core structural problems with the interchange system. There was a bill that passed out of Texas committee earlier this week unanimously that gets at the fee schedules, which are centrally fixed, on behalf of all the banks. Another bill, passed out of House in Colorado, doing the same. So there are broader approaches. With all of them, I think this question, which is percolating in the Illinois courts about who do states have authority to regulate, that question is going to come up. But what the court has pretty strongly said in Illinois is there's no preemption for Visa and MasterCard. States can act to rein in Visa and MasterCard, which is critical because Visa and MasterCard set all the rules. They dictate the fees. They are not banks, but they are telling banks, what to do, and banks are more than happy to copy and use the fees and rules that Visa and MasterCard set. It's been a gap in our system, which in my view has been exploited to enable charging a lot more in fees than a competitive system would bear.
Senator Hardy.
I would just, I think it's a good idea to ask Attorney General's office. I also would just say that I think that one of the goals that potentially of the bill and one that I see is to try to help out our really struggling restaurants who are having to pay this fee. And I think that they're the small businesses that would benefit the most from it. So it might be interesting to hear from, if we're going to pursue this bill, and I don't know, we have a lot on our plate, but if we are, to hear from the Restaurants Association or somebody there to see how that, whether this would work for them, and or if they have different ideas on how to get the similar relief that would work better. I don't know, but for me, that's what it seems like. Restaurants are really struggling in our state right now, and being able to help them out by, this I agree would be small, and I think, it sucks that our tiny little small restaurants in Vermont are getting screwed over by these big multinational corporations. So I would love to be able to do this, but if there's another way that we could accomplish the same thing that might be easier, I don't know.
It would be cleaner to just say you can't charge more than X.
It would be cleaner if we could do that.
You wouldn't have to be investing in new equipment. You wouldn't have to be saving your sales slips and sending them in. We can have the Attorney General come in and ask for comments and recommendations on this. See where that leads us. We did ask the grocers to come in on the cash. The grocers are here. Okay. And we have time. You're not on the agenda, but you wanna?
It's been the cash pick.
Yeah, this is on the cash section.
Yeah. Do you want me to can I do it?
Thanks, Dan.
No, come on.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Introduce
Prepared,
yourself.
but I'm happy.
Thank you, Mr. Swanson. I think we're going on to the second half of this bill. We will hear from our Attorney General and what they think would be a good legal move at this point.
Thank you, Senators. Appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate yours.
Maggie Lenz, I'm representing the Vermont Retail Grocers Association. Thanks for letting me speak. So I want to be clear, we support the credit card reform portion of this bill. That's something that we worked really hard to get approved from both chambers.
Can your mom and pops do this?
They're saying that they can and that they'd like to have the option to.
Okay.
Yeah. The cash requirement, we're pretty much neutral on. I've been talking to members big and small. It is, as far as I can tell right now, 100% of our members already accept cash. So I think we don't necessarily.
No, it's not allow cash. What this says is you can't say after 10 o'clock at night, we don't take cash.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, and so we already take cash. Our members already across the board take
All
cash.
of them take cash,
All of them.
even at 2 a.m.
That's what I heard.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've checked in with, Erin Segrist, who represented them last time
Yeah.
around, and she agrees that 100% of our members already take cash. So I think the feeling on that, it's neutrality, it's that we don't necessarily see that there's a problem to solve, but we're fine with that piece. And we are really incredibly supportive of, obviously, the swipe fee reform. And I have done my own unofficial polls just downtown Montpelier, talking to folks I used to work with in the restaurant industry, and Senator Hardy's right. The restaurants are, I think, going to be the most meaningful recipients of this, but the small stores too. Just the small grocers and the retailers, the mom and pops. It makes a difference. These fees really do make a difference. There is some concern. Members have asked, well, how would we implement this? Would it be difficult? And I just want to be really clear that this is an option. It's not mandatory. We can choose to pursue it.
But the outcome could be that we would allow the big national chains who have the sophisticated software to take advantage of this, and the mom and pops might well look at what their increased fee for, more advanced programming in their machine would be, or the nuisance factor of having to save all your slips and send them in. We may find that we are benefiting the big guys over the little guys, but
I don't think at their expense.
No, I was just gonna say, I actually am not sure. I mean, it might be interesting to hear from them, because I think and you might know more than me, but the things that most places use the software in those little boxes that we all put our cards on, it breaks everything out, breaks out tips, breaks out taxes, breaks out the cost of every kind of item. You get those really itemized slips that are like, even at the grocery store, did you buy this in the bulk section or the produce section or the whatever, because everything has a cart, number, whatever those numbers are called. Scan numbers. So I actually think that even the small ones, for maybe not all of them, but most of them have fairly sophisticated software that already does it.
okay.
And especially restaurants, a lot of them are using the POS system.
Exactly.
Okay.
Do you get that granularity on your credit card statements? So when you look at your transactions, do you see for each charge how much was taxed?
No.
You know.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that having a POS that can itemize it is very different from that continues through the credit card process. I mean, all a POS says you owe $53 and it sends a request to the credit card processor for $53, but it doesn't say it's $45 of product and $5 of tax and,
But the merchant has that amount. So the merchant has the ability, had it all broken out. So
Yeah,
there
the
could be some kind of reporting mechanism
Yeah,
where they report
but
it.
they would have to keep copies of that breakout.
Synchronize across.
Otherwise, we
Yeah.
could do Senator Mass's suggestion and have a $10 dinner and a $20.
Oh, heck yeah, just make it all gratuity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And I think that came up in the House Commerce Committee, and my understanding is that there's mechanisms from Ledge Council that we could put in the bill to make sure that that's not.
and we'll have to, I don't know which Ledge Council will do this one. We will have the Attorney General in to talk about the interstate commerce.
Yeah.
Mr. Basil.
Section and the risk that if there is a court, I'm cautious, if there is a court case at this point, I would like to do this, but rather than have us get involved in litigation, I would rather let the courts decide that we have jurisdiction.
Understood.
And then use it. But having lost some, court cases get very expensive. So any other questions for Maggie? Okay, well, we've gone from 45-minute break to a 5-minute break.